Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session about AI. We're really excited at Aspen Ideas Health to have this event and this really fun conversation today. I am Tina Reed. I am the healthcare editor for Axios. I am joined by Heather Lane, the senior architect of the data science team and data subdivision of platform and data services at Athena Health. She has technical oversight of machine learning, AI, and natural language processing activities there. We're also joined by Troy Tasbas, Director of Digital Health Center of Excellence with the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. Thank you so much. So, AI. It could potentially save healthcare $360 billion annually. In some cases, it shows more empathy than doctors themselves. It could help find cures for diseases faster than we ever thought possible, but it also comes with some very serious risks, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, are some of the very exciting possibilities, but also some of the risks we need to take into account. So to start, at Axios, we always like to start with a one big thing, and I wanted to start with a takeaway you want people to think about if they take nothing away from today, of what is one thing they should be really excited about and one thing maybe they might be a little terrified about. So, Troy, do you want to go first?
Sure. And I love, all these documents that are talking about that's better at empathy than most of you. So I'm sure you're all probably very offended by this. Well, artificial intelligence has been kind of around for quite some time, but I think the innovations that we're currently seeing are fairly new, right? Especially the way that it's being integrated into the healthcare system. And, when I think about the problem statement, it's essentially, how do you actually optimize each part of the value chain of delivering healthcare? And I use that word quite a bit, value chain, because if you think about it, it's all from drug development to medical device development, all the way into, delivering the actual care, and even the clinical decision support systems that are being integrated into the EHRs to augment some of the decisions that you all are probably making. So some of the things that I'm very excited about are more around the process innovation that it could potentially enable, and not necessarily just the product innovation. And what you all probably have been hearing quite a bit is all of the amazing things that we can do in the clinical care side of things. But where I'm actually most excited about is fixing some of the process issues that we're all seeing in the industry itself. And part of that process issue is also the burnout that we're seeing, right? So earlier I was at a wonderful speech and they were talking about the real issues around burnout, and some of the statistics were actually worse than I ever actually read about. And something like 60% of all medical professionals are experiencing burnout, and one was very alarming, which is medical professionals have 2 times more likely to commit suicide than a non-medical professional, and that's a very scary thought to me. And so, when I look at this, I'm thinking that it could perhaps fix some of the structural issues that we're seeing that is causing some of these burnouts with more administrative, fixing some of the administrative innovation areas that we're looking at. So where you should be a little bit more concerned is what I see from FD is the lack of discipline yet around how we're thinking about developing these algorithms, making sure that we understand the life cycle management of these algorithms. And what I mean by that is that if you think about an AI as a value chain, right? It's it's data that you use. It's the actual algorithm, the model itself that is answering something, and then the answer itself, right? And that's really at a very high level what it is. And when we talk about health equity, if we don't have the data representation when you're building these models, but beyond that, if you don't have some sort of a post-market surveillance that understands whether the data that is coming in from collecting information is also representative of the data that is representative of the population, that's going to cause issues. So I would say that's probably the bigger risk in artificial intelligence as we're thinking about AI in the context of healthcare delivery.
And Heather.
Yeah, so first I need to give you a warning that I'm recovering from a cold that my daughter gifted me with. So I apologize in advance if I croak at you during this session. So yeah, I agree with everything you just said. So let's see, the one big excitement, the one big takeaway. Stepping back a bit, I'll say that I've been working professionally in artificial intelligence since about 1995, and I've never seen a moment like this. This is crazy. It's amazing and it's wonderful, but it's crazy. when I look at the reason it's exciting to me, and I think to a lot of others, is that when you look at like the scope of human technology over history, for most of human history, we built these single-purpose things, right? We built, a hammer that drives nails, a car goes from point A to point B. A rocket ship goes very fast from point A to point B, but it still basically goes from point A to point B, right? Starting in the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, we began to build these multi-purpose tools, right? Like printing presses. They could do many things, right? And then in the 20th century, we saw that blossom with the computer. But it feels to me like we're now beginning to enter an age where we're beginning to build these tools that are beyond that level of flexible. They're almost omni-purpose tools, right? Something like ChatGPT or generative art AI, right? These things can do this amazing breadth of stuff, most of which they were never originally designed to do. They're just sort of, surprisingly in there. And that, I think, unlocks possibilities technologically that we didn't have before, even a few years ago. Right? And to me, that tells me that we're on the cusp of this transformational change that's going to hit us broadly across society and deeply within healthcare. And I absolutely agree with everything you said about the administrative side of healthcare. And we at Athena Health hope that we can leverage some of these technologies to help pull down those administrative burdens and help the burnout part. To give you just one more data point for context there. If you were at this morning's talk with Dr. Fauci and Senator Frist, a brilliant talk, they're talking about, the program to fight AIDS worldwide. $110 billion of investment over 20 years, hugely transformative, saved 25 million lives. $110 billion, 20 years. In the US, every year we spend something like $382 billion on healthcare administrative costs, right? 3 times more in 1 year than they spent in 20 years to save 25 million lives, right? So can we bring these powerful AI technologies to assist and pull down some of that effort? So that's a place that I find very, very exciting. The risk, as you say, right, there's so many risks in the AI space, but a prominent one is that we know that there are deep embedded, systemic biases in the healthcare system. They impact many, many communities, communities of color especially, migrant communities, communities who don't have English as a first language, right? AI offers a great possibility to help there, both on the administrative side, things like automated language translation to lower interface barriers, things like that. But it offers a great deal of danger too, right? For those who aren't familiar, bias is a part of AI too. We train AI on human data, and so it becomes a mirror of us. It mirrors our good selves and it mirrors our bad selves, right? And if we're not careful, it will reflect the bad selves back to us, right? And that has the possibility of deepening those inequities that we already have. And so we have to be very thoughtful as we go forward to use it as a tool to reduce inequities rather than increase them.
I'd like to touch on that a little bit more. Because if you think about it, one of the biggest struggles right now in the industry itself is integration of technology, right? So, I always kind of joke about it. When we talk about digital health, and I was like, well, is there such thing as an analog health that we say digital health here? But I mean, and for me, it's really just simply technology integration into healthcare delivery. And so if you think about kind of the health equities right now, as we're talking about data being used to develop some of these algorithms, and if there's friction and cost associated to integrating artificial intelligence into your, let's say, everyday life in a hospital system, which means that the larger hospital systems are going to probably have the budgets to integrate this stuff, and of course, they're going to be serving a specific population that is going to actually cause even further inequities, right? So the issue here is it's beyond technology. It's really around education as well. And so I've been part of a lot of discussions, particularly around data privacy, where we use data privacy as either a protection mechanism, but we're also not thinking about it from an enablement perspective. And what I mean by that, educating some of the population segments that have hesitation, rightfully so, to actually give their data to the government, right? And that's causing even further inequities. Right, so we have to kind of work through that, and I'm 4 months into the government, by the way. I come from the more industry side of things, and this is not going to be done by the government. This has to be done by the folks who are actually can speak the language and talk about the benefits of why we have to get the data in there. So drug development, care delivery, all of that could actually take in consideration of some of these differences. So I just want to kind of, as you're all thinking about this, is how do we actually influence the segment who has hesitation about giving their data, because that is actually causing further inequities, because we're not using that for R&D, both from a drug development as well as some of these medical device developments.
I want to dig deeper into how do we regulate this, but first I want to try and level set of how much is AI already being used in healthcare, and then how did ChatGPT just really put some gas behind the conversation about how we want to use AI in healthcare?
So FDA has we've approved about 520 devices, but this is all predictive algorithms. So what we are talking about, generative AI or large language models, are adaptive, right? So we haven't approved anything, and this is a vastly different paradigm for us from a regulation perspective. And the reason I say that is that predictive algorithms or software or hardware, they tend to be static in nature, right? These are locked systems. Once you deploy them, not a lot has changed, right? I mean, where adaptive algorithms like large language models adapt and they change when new data is being entered. Now, the reality is the innovations that we're all reading about these days have been around since like November of 2022, right? This is fairly new. Like ChatGPT 3 was released in November 2022, and then ChatGPT 4 was released, I think, 3 months later, if I recall. So, I mean, think about the pace of innovation of that, right? So from a regulatory perspective, we're always having to play catch up. So now we're having to think about this thing slightly differently. And my background was engineering and operations, so I have to think of everything from an infrastructure point of view. So when I do talk about regulation, I'm not necessarily talking about we're going to regulate AI. I'm talking about how do we audit each of the layers of an algorithm, the data that you use, the foundational models, and then how do you also audit the application, which is slightly differently. And I can use this as it's analogous to cloud. So you've all heard internet or infrastructure as a service, like just storage and compute that you can get from any cloud provider. Well, when you up level that, there's actually software as a service, which is the software that is sitting on that, right? And that could be two different companies. Now, this is where it's going to become very interesting for a regulatory agency, because now all of a sudden we have to regulate both the foundational model, which is what you hear ChatGPT and Bard from Google, and we also have to think about the application of some company using those large language models or the foundational models to actually deliver some sort of a product. And so, I've been in here for about 4 months now, but this is where I'm spending a tremendous amount of my mind and energy on right now. So the reality is that I didn't come here to say that we need to regulate this, but this is really not going to be done by either the private side or the public side. This is really truly a public-private partnership opportunity, and that's what we're doing. We're not necessarily saying that we're going to go about this alone. We have to essentially partner with the private sector, the academia, but we have to very, very quickly start operationalizing this, because I think we've talked about the principles for too long. Let's define what transparency is, but when I ask the question, well, how do you actually report on transparency? What tools do you have? How should I think about this thing from a product regulation? Everybody just looks at me, right? So, the focus has been really around operationalizing this thing in order to make sure that, safety and effective, which is the guiding principle of FDA, can be actually achieved. It's not easy, by the way. So.
I'm not sure what to say. I mean, there's so much there. So let's see, backing up to AI impacts in healthcare. I mean, AI is an old field, right? It's getting a lot of press right now, but the AI field goes back to 1950. And people have been working on AI applications to medicine and healthcare for a considerable fraction of that time. And so, you spoke to medical devices that have embedded AI. But there's, lots of other places where AI impacts medicine, right? Like, if you were at the cancer panel earlier, they were talking about the use of AI to do, drug development, pharmacological development, identification of targets for for oncology. Huge amounts of data understanding and data science devoted to early stage discovery in the fundamentals of medicine. You see medical robotics, right? But closer to my world and some of the issues that you were talking about, you made the distinction between predictive and generative AI, but there's also another part, which is, maybe documentary or extractive AI. And that's a thing that we do a reasonable fraction of at Athena because, those of you out there who are providers or who work in clinics are very much aware that the US healthcare system still runs heavily on paper, in spite of all the electronic systems out there. There's lots of paperwork, there's lots of faxes, there's lots of notes, some handwritten, some typed. But all of that stuff is, is human accessible, but not very computer accessible. So there's a lot of work we've been doing to use AI to pull data out of that, turn it into structured data that you can put in patient charts so it becomes accessible to physicians, and then you can aggregate so it becomes useful at a population level, right? So there you're not making a prediction. You're not trying to say who's going to get sick. You're trying to say what happened in the past, what was documented, what really happened in the real world, right? And that's an incredibly important use, right? Because if we don't do it with computers, then a clinical office staff has to do it, right? Or we have to pay a third party to do it, right? So some human has to do it. That's an impact in a place where it shows up. I don't know, so many others. I think I've wandered off topic.
Well, ChatGPT seemed to change that conversation, though.
Right, okay, yeah. So from my perspective, as I argued a moment ago, ChatGPT is very exciting because it represents this sort of sea change in our technological capabilities, our foundational capabilities. But I think beyond that, it suddenly made the whole AI space much more vivid to people. Because now anybody who had internet access could sit down and go to OpenAI, get an account, play with ChatGPT, and you could type in, write me an outline for speech that I might give at, Aspen Ideas Health about the impact of AI in healthcare, and it will write it for you. And you say, okay, that's lovely. Now do it, in the style of a Broadway hip-hop musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda, and it will do that, right? So, but that, that's wild and kind of silly, but it makes it incredibly vivid, right? Anybody can do this, anybody can play with it, and they begin to feel the possibilities, they begin to feel the capabilities. I can say that very shortly after ChatGPT was released, we saw within our company this upsurge of interest, right? I've been there for 5 years, and I've been arguing, importance of AI. AI can be transformative across our technological product suite everywhere, right? I've been making, uphill argument, very Sisyphean, right? Rock kept rolling back on me, got the bruises on my toes. But this came out, all of a sudden everybody around the organization could play with it. They could see it, right? They could try, hey, I want to summarize a patient chart, right? Well, let's go get a patient chart, not a proprietary one. We'll go get one from public data so that we're not releasing PHI, thank you. But we'll go get it, we'll feed it through and say, ChatGPT, tell me what's in this, and it'll do it, right? And they can see that, and all of a sudden it's much more vivid, right? And this grounds the conversation. It allows us to envision what the possibilities are. And that's really where the starting point of product is, right? That's really where people begin to move to, here's what we can do and here's what we should do. And here we can begin to envision the future, right? Before that, the future is always very hazy.
I know it got DC's attention on Capitol Hill. All of a sudden, I hear about AI all the time. But the problem is that AI is extremely hard to understand. Ted Cruz said Congress doesn't know what the hell it is doing regulating AI. The Washington Post recently wrote about industry meetings coming in to teach members of Congress about it. I'm curious, from your perspective, how do we get a handle on this thing without industry's help, but also without industry writing its own rules?
Well, I had hoped originally to come here and give a lecture on linear algebra to all of you, but I decided that was not the best thing to do. No, I mean, you're right. There's a very complex technology space, but I don't think that you necessarily need to understand the underlying, way it works in order to understand what its capabilities are and to think about what those impacts are of that. And you certainly don't need to, you can now, because it's accessible and vivid, you can now put examples in front of people of the way that, it breaks down, or places where there are problems with it. You can begin to show people directly where the inequities are, where, there are many examples that people generated very early on with ChatGPT showing hey, it still has encoded sexism and racism and homophobia and transphobia and Islamophobia and the whole list. It's still in there, right? OpenAI has done an excellent job of putting guardrails around that and hiding it from us, but it's still in there, and you can generate examples to show people. And when you show them like that, it becomes much more vivid. They don't necessarily need to understand the how in order to understand the what. And that's my personal perspective.
Well, I might have some opinions about this. So, how do I say this without necessarily offending the federal government too? I think regulation could be very valuable in this space, and it can also be very prohibitive. And that could be in the sense that it could be unimplementable by anybody, or it could effectively just essentially stymie innovation, right? And that's what you also have to think through. So what we've been doing more at the HHS level, and when I joined, one of the things that I really wanted to do, especially in the artificial intelligence space, is not go about it alone, in the sense that let's not do it from FDA's point of view or CMS's point of view or NIH's point of view, but really the point of view of healthcare. So what we've been doing over the last several months is really trying to, as more and more inquiries are coming from both the White House as well as the legislative arm, is trying to ensure that they're not writing something that is just so high level that it's really not implementable by anyone. And, I've been on the other side before where I looked at regulation and I'm like, I have no idea what to do with this. And what I don't do is waste so much time while that process happens, so that's where the education and ongoing education happens. So what we're trying to do is really talk about, you write the framework and let's put an actually industry-centric point of view to it. Because some of the considerations that we have, or the guardrails that we need in healthcare, are going to be vastly different than a different, let's say, industry, whether that's defense or retail, right? We all have our different considerations. So you can't write just a blanket legislation on artificial intelligence and expect it to be successful. So what we're really trying to focus on is, look, give us the framework around what the national agenda around AI should be, and let us actually think through the healthcare portion of that agenda. And if we can't do that, we can't implement this. So what I will say to you is that they've been responsive to this when we actually talk about it in this context. Now, what you all can do beyond just the industry, which I can't really directly recommend this, is that right now, we operate within a statute that was written or enacted in 1976. This is the Medical Device Regulatory Act. We use this to, quote unquote, regulate artificial intelligence. So you can imagine, the complexities of that, right? So, and when I talk about the issue with particularly not having the regulatory flexibility to be able to deal with a different type of product, how I describe it is, a medical device, you don't release a medical device in piecemeal fashion, like just a functionality, and then you come back and you add another functionality, right? Well, software, there was a different paradigm in software as a medical device, where you can release a function or a feature, and then you go back and you add another feature, and there's a different life cycle management of how that life cycle evolves. Well, in predictive AI is kind of similar to software, but obviously when we're talking about generative AI, that lifecycle management process that we always talk about when we talk about product is different, right? So the traditional laws or the statutes that we're governed by just are not applicable, right? So what we're trying to do is, how do we ensure certain flexibilities where, again, we keep the underlying infrastructure to be safe and effective, but we also allow that type of innovation to happen through the adaptive nature of the product itself, right? So Now, the government actually has to hear from their constituents, right? It's not just from the industry or someone, let's say, in my shoes, but it's really around, how does the public kind of view this? That means that there has to be an education on the public as well. Like, we can't be fear-based around all of these issues and what we kind of read about, where it's going to come and take over. I mean, if you think about all the supply chain issues and the massive GPUs that you require to even power AI, all you have to do is just stop the supply chain issue, and it stops right there. So, but I would, encourage you all to kind of really truly understand some of these complexities, but also the risks associated, but also the benefits of the potential benefits of what it could deliver to yours. So, when I talk about administrative issues within the healthcare system and the process innovation, right? So, the discussion that was earlier, they talked about, the nursing community spends about 50% of their time in administrative overhead, and the physicians are about 70%, right? That's a pretty statistic. So why that's a big problem is that if you have labor shortage and then you have burnout rates, well, what's going to happen? You're going to have fewer people who are going to be able to attend what they love doing, right? Which means that when you want to schedule an appointment, that is going to get delayed, and then perhaps the costs are going to increase because all of a sudden that you're also having to pay a higher cost in providing medical care. So when I speak to the industry about this, what I really try to tell them is that, be thoughtful about where you prioritize your investments and your innovation at this point, because everybody wants to solve the big sexy thing, like I want to cure cancer, I want to predict sepsis, I want to do this. And what I'm also talking about is like, well, why can't you just innovate the process at this point? Because that's a very large addressable market to begin with. And if you think about this thing from just a purely return on investment, that's a good way to start. But it also, it can actually lead to better outcomes, which is why most people are getting into this business, right? So why the better outcomes can happen? Well, now all of a sudden you have less burden on the professionals who are actually delivering the care. Right? So now they can think about it slightly differently. And my colleagues over here talked about joy, like let's bring the joy back into the profession itself. And this is where, in my opinion, technology could really help. And so it's all about where we want to prioritize. And I'm spending a tremendous amount of time with some of these either entrepreneurs or some of the larger companies and saying, and this is the message that I've been delivering.
I'd like to follow up on that if I could. So first of all, I personally and Athena Health believes very deeply that we do need regulation in the AI space. But I agree that, it's not going to be possible to write one omnibus that covers all of it, right? And I don't expect Congress to do it. What I do expect them to do, hopefully, is be able to set up the framework, as you say, and be able to delegate that to the appropriate bodies so that you all can be, in charge of helping develop the regulations around medical devices and drug discovery, and ONC can handle EHRs, and but as I said, this stuff is going to impact all sorts of facets of society, so we're going to have to bring in people from all over the spectrum. And I think what we need to do is get everybody into the same room, right? And that's always the real challenge, right? But we need, I don't want industry to be writing the rules themselves, right? Like you say, but I want us to be part of the discussion, right? But I think, government regulatory bodies need to be part of the discussion. Academic researchers need to be part of the discussion. Huge amount of research going on in the machine learning and AI communities right now about AI bias, right? A lot of it being driven by women of color, right? Who were the early ones to see, where these biases were, to detect them and raise them, right? There's people in the media who, ProPublica is finding things, right? And so on, all these different groups are seeing facets of the issue, right? And we need consumer representatives. We need representatives from marginalized communities in the room to help shape what the regulations are, right? We need all the voices together. And that's the hard part, right? We always say, well, we got to have a conversation about this in this country, and we do, but, really big subject, moving super fast. And when you try to gather all these people together, it's hard to do that on the timeline of everything moving super, super fast, because industry is out there innovating, academia is out there innovating, China is out there innovating, and let me tell you, they're not going to listen to our regulations. Russia's got it, building its models, right? Like, European Union is doing its thing, right? This stuff is exploding everywhere, and we need to move as fast as possible, but we need to involve all these different groups so we can get all the right perspectives into the room in order to be able to make regulation that is both meaningful, achieves the safety goals we want, is implementable, will have buy-in from the different groups who, the industry groups, the consumer groups and so on that are impacted by it, right? All these different factors. Very hard problem, but I know we've got a lot of leaders and a lot of policymakers out here in the room, so I'm asking you to be part of making those conversations happen.
And when you talk about that, using the example of bias, one of the ideas of standards that have been thrown out there is we need more transparency in our algorithms. Are there other particular standards that are just, they have to be part of this framework and part of this discussion?
I believe so. And I mean, first of all, transparency it's an easy thing to say and a hard thing to understand. You talked about the challenge of defining transparency. We did an internal analysis just within our company and found that we had at least 5 or 6 different stakeholder groups and at least 6 different notions of transparency. So when you did the cross matrix, you had 30 different, combinations of what we meant when we said transparency.
That's one company, by the way.
Yeah, you're right. You're totally right, right? And so that's one facet. But, measurable fairness is another important one. Can you measure that the system is going to have outcome equity for all of the constituencies it impacts, right? Can you measure that? Can you document it? How do you measure it? How do you document it? Do you have the data to show that, all the different, groups of people and communities that the system is going to impact? You talked about the challenge of getting data from different communities. They have to be represented in order for us to be able to say that the system is or is not biased with respect to them, right? And then there are challenges about, well, what does it mean for a system to be fair, right? Turns out when you look at it mathematically, there's multiple notions of fairness, and some of them are mathematically incompatible. You simply don't get to have all the notions of fairness at the same time. So you have to decide which one to pick, right? And maybe that's a decision that should be made at the regulatory level, right? So these are kinds of issues that show up. To the extent possible, I would like us to see us guardrail, potential uses of this technology, right? People have skirted around the idea of facial recognition, and large companies like, Google and Facebook have, voluntarily said we're not going to do face recognition in our AI systems. But that's entirely voluntary, right? It'd be nice to have a standard saying what we are and are not going to do, with AI technologies.
What's the healthcare concern with that?
With what we are and are not going to do?
With the facial recognition, for instance, what would be?
Well, there's very clear law enforcement issues there. There was an example of a guy who was incorrectly arrested and held because the facial recognition system picked him mostly because of skin color, not because of the right, who he was. But there are all sorts of dangers in applications of AI to healthcare in terms of if you develop an AI system that wasn't developed on data that's representative of all the population, then it could say, for example, there was an example of one that underpredicted the need of healthcare for Black patients, right? Compared to white patients, But that's not should we be predicting the need of healthcare? Yes, probably. That's a thing we should be doing. Should we do it fairly? Absolutely, right? And they hadn't done the proper due diligence. They went back and fixed it, right? But they hadn't done the due diligence up front. But are there things we shouldn't be doing with AI in healthcare? I'm not sure off the top of my head.
I think it's maybe more using the technology for other types of image recognition software, right? So has anyone here heard of the Shirley card? You have. And I think, yeah. So I love telling this story. So, and I don't know how accurate this story is, but in 1960s, in Kodak, which you all are very familiar, they were effectively working on a new technology, cameras, right? And they were trying to calibrate the filming of it, right? And the engineer who was in charge of this was in love with this woman named Shirley. And she had a very, very specific color, like very white. And so he calibrated the camera to her picture that ended up becoming an entire industry standard all the way until Google came out with the true color image camera, which was only a year ago. Now, so I love telling that story because you think this person said, I wanted to have bias towards, darker skinned individuals? No. But this is the unintended bias that happens when engineers are getting into it and not being thoughtful about how they actually develop these things, right? So what did that do for the last, 70 years, right? It modulated or calibrated every picture and every camera slightly lighter. You might not recognize it when you look at a photo, but now if you're applying that technology into something that requires such precision, that's where we start having problems. And this is why we started having problems in radiology with darker skinned folks. This is the very reason of that, right? So, when we talk about bias, we have to understand that we have, issues around that we don't even know what we're doing from a product development and how to actually think about this, right? So this is an ongoing education. Now, to your question around, how do we regulate all of this stuff? It's so complex, and the pace of change. I kind of mentioned about this, right? It's moving so fast. What we can't do, though, is that we can't just sit there and expect, this complete regulation to come. It really has to take some agility to it, right? Which is not necessarily the core competency of the federal government unless something really bad happens, right? That's when they really are very agile. And what we saw, and I've been here for 4 months, and when people ask me the difference between, and I said, they do the hard things really, really well, and the easy things not so great. And so this is one of those areas that, again, I just don't think this is going to be a government-only initiative. This cannot be, right? It has to be done through a partnership both with the community, patient advocate groups. It has to have the technology providers. But what we also have to think about is a joint objective. Like, what is our objective with artificial intelligence, particularly in the healthcare delivery? And then on top of that, we have to do a risk-based assessment on how we prioritize these things. And maybe we don't start with the things that have the most risk, and we start with things that have lower risk in the way they're developed and integrated. And I think that's the conversation that it has to happen at all levels, right? What does that risk profile look like with every possible use of artificial intelligence? And then how do you prioritize that? And that's the conversations that we are trying to have. And I'm only one voice. And so I think that this needs to really be done by also the constituents. And then what we have to also do a very good job is educating the medical professionals who are going to have to use this stuff. And what we can't do, which is what is happening right now, is hospital systems are rushing because they don't want to be the last hospital system that has artificial intelligence, yet they haven't actually figured out how to integrate this. And so we have to think about in terms of truly integration. And that's not going to be done by the technology people who are developing this stuff. And I was one of them. And it's not going to be done just by the medical professional. It has to be like a separate profession that truly understands both the care process and the technology.
We're going to open up to questions. So if any of you have a question, raise your hand. There's folks with mics that are going to be coming around. I see some hands over here. Please. And if you could please stand up and introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Connor Sheehy. I'm with the Senate Finance Committee, and take no offense to your comments because I don't think we know much about AI at this point, nor do I feel like we're all that well equipped to get in the weeds on regulation. I think to that end, I'm interested in your guys' thoughts on two concerns that have been raised with respect to even a high-level framework for regulation here. I think number one, on transparency of algorithms, there are a lot of IP concerns not everyone operates like Sam Altman at OpenAI. It's going to be a trade secret, proprietary, IP-driven industry. So I'm interested in how you guys thread that needle. And then the other piece you talked about is I think there's a concern around actually seeing more consolidation in the industry because we will bury a lot of startups in a lot of paperwork and reporting requirements. And unlike the incumbents, they don't have the compliance departments and they don't have the lobbyists who can come to us and say, hey, we're happy to help you write legislation that they know their lawyers can get them around. So I think you guys alluded to both those, but just interested in your thoughts. And again, thanks for a great talk.
Yeah, those are both huge issues.
Well, I have solutions, you know.
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
Sure.
First.
Okay, so to your first question, do we understand AI? And I think what you're maybe referring to is more explainability of how the algorithm is actually developed, and transparency is more around what type of data that you used, what is it actually doing. So those are two separate things, and I think what you're referring to is now that a lot of people are talking about, can we truly explain the algorithm development? And mind you, that is really only applied to large language models. So remember, there are different types of flavors here, right? So we have to pick and choose in where we apply some of these comments on, right? So, so that's one issue. Now, I agree with you that we have to be more transparent, but the transparency can't just be about, okay, this is the data that I've used, but it's also showing the data that you didn't use, why you actually omitted it, right? That's what transparency means. And it could be a very valid reason. I'm developing this algorithm for a very, very specific segment of population, and therefore I have to get it to the market. Now, where the risk becomes is that you cannot proliferate that algorithm outside of that very, very specific area. This is where it gets really dangerous. Now, to your second question, this happened in the cloud world, right? So I worked at Oracle, and so I am part of the problem in that sense, right? So what we are talking about here, the problem is the cost of building some of these large language models, right? But we saw that with cloud. What happened? Sure, the infrastructure side of cloud maybe became a monopoly, and it's not really a monopoly. There's 5 of them, right? What we call hyperscalers. But what it did, it proliferated software development because all of a sudden, building a data center was no longer the cost-prohibitive part of the equation of building software. So you can actually make the same argument, and by the way, that's a very capitalistic kind of thing that we have to resolve here, and I don't think that the government is going to ever get into, I'm going to make sure that you cannot grow and scale, because part of the second part is that sometimes the foundational model might be better served with a company that has the resources and the money to go build it, while also the reputation to build it. And then what that could do is enable the innovation to happen at the application layer, right? So you're right about, but this is, by the way, this is beyond artificial intelligence. This has been a problem with mergers and acquisitions. 80% of mergers and acquisitions, by the way, are failing because they don't necessarily achieve the intended reason of why they. And the part of the problem is that they stop innovating, they stop investing in that acquisition, right? So same thing is going to happen, but I don't think that's an AI-specific issue. That's just generally an economic issue. So, to your point, I think there's a risk, but also a value, perhaps, that large language models or the foundational models maybe should be built on some of these bigger companies that have the risk profile is bigger than, let's say, a startup, right? So think about that, right? Boeing is always going to figure out the risk profile because they're Boeing, and Microsoft is always going to think about their risk profile, so they're going to probably approach this slightly differently. So there's a give and take that you have to consider in this one.
I would like to add a little bit to that. So the thing about transparency and IP, so I mentioned that, we identified this sort of matrix of 30 different kinds of transparency. Not all of those were IP threatening, right? Some of them were, some of them weren't, right? But there were ones that, I think we would be perfectly happy to expose externally, right? But when you think about where the real value in AI is these days, right? Is it in the computer hardware? No. You can rent that for cents on the hour from Amazon, right? Is it in the raw software layers? No, Google is giving that away and Facebook is giving that away. Is it in the algorithms? Not really. Those are mostly published in the open literature. And the truth is that knowing the algorithm doesn't help you by itself. Is it in the data? Absolutely. Those companies will never, ever show you their data, right? They will give you their algorithms, they will give you their software, they will rent you their computers, they will never show you their data, right? That's where the IP is. So the question becomes, is there a way we can make the transparency issues around the data that you were describing while still protecting people's need for that IP in such a way that they're not going to fight you tooth and nail the whole way? And I believe yes, because I don't think you need to show every single data point. I think what you need to show is, the aggregate statistics of who's represented in this population, what are their fractions, how did you gather that data, how do you know that the data gathering is unbiased, right? There's a bunch of issues like that you can report on without having to see the original data. And I suspect that if we head in this direction, you'll see like third-party auditors arising, the same way that there are auditors who look at your finances, right? You're not going to go show your finances to the whole world, but you are going to show them to your auditors, right? They have a very strong legal obligation. I think you can do the same thing with data, right? I think there are ways around some of these issues.
And there's a precedence: PCI, FedRAMP. These,
Right here.
Francis Najafi from Phoenix. I could not agree more with what you just said. The issue is not so much, as I understand, right, around other technologies, it's not so much different algorithm, which is an instruction to computer what to do with data. It is the data and access to data, equal access to data, and in particular, equal access to impartial data. And that's the area that could be some regulation, I guess. Please react to that comment.
Look, here's what I can say about this. We are trying to resolve, but it's much harder than you might imagine. So there are multiple friction areas about this. One is there are actually some parts of the population that do not want to essentially give their data for these types of aggregation. The second part of this is that, there was a panel earlier, they're talking about intellectual property, which means that data becomes intellectual property. And there's this drive to monetize that data. So we all fundamentally agree with what you're saying, that data is really required and representative data is required, but it's beyond that, right? So where we have to go, and now, I used to say this at Oracle, and unfortunately at Oracle, people would say, well, what's in it for Oracle? Well, I'm going to put my data in, all of a sudden I'm paying you for storage cost, right? In the federal government, it becomes much easier because I get to talk about, well, guess what? If I'm going to do a safety and effective standard, and I'm thinking about this thing from a pre-market authorization, but also understanding the surveillance that is needed for the post-market performance of those algorithms, then I need that data. I need real-world evidence to ensure that these things, what we call drift, doesn't happen. So we have those conversations, but the only thing that I could say to this community here, which there are a lot of healthcare professionals here, is you have to talk to your administrators about this, right? This is not something, I can certainly have those conversations, and I do, but again, this is not going to be done by a single agency or a single company. This has to be done by understanding that there's a risk associated to not sharing data, and how do we work with the community to ensure that the HIPAA laws that we have, which by the way is not regulated by FDA, it is actually thinking about the contribution of this in order to make sure that we advance science. That has to happen.
Got a question over here.
Thanks, John Feller, Indian Wells, California. My question is about ground truth. With the predictive analytics that the FDA has approved, they're pretty good ground truths, things like biopsy results, clinical follow-up to determine if an algorithm has, appropriate performance. But with the large language solutions, there's pretty substantial hallucination rates, right? And we're talking about healthcare, so a hallucination rate doesn't really sound good to me unless you're a substance abuse doctor.
Which then it sounds amazing, right?
So my question is this an emerging opportunity in the industry to develop a ground truth solution for these large language solutions? And what are we supposed to use in the interval before we start transitioning, trust to the large language solutions?
Well, I would say that, so first of all, generative AI and large language models are not the only AI. There's lots of other AI that is rooted into ground truth. You know, I gave some examples of stuff that we're doing at Athena Health in terms of being able to extract data from real documents. Right, the ground truth there is what happened in the real world, right? So you do have a tie there. But your core point is very well taken. The large language models, generative AI systems, they do hallucinate, right? And that's a thing that is sort of under-recognized in general. But we have to control that. That's a very active conversation for us. It's a very active conversation around the entire industry, and you're seeing architectures emerge. The way that Bing handles it at the moment, for example, is that they take your question, they translate it into a document lookup, they feed a bunch of documents back to ChatGPT, and it summarizes them for you. So now what it's giving you is not a hallucination, but is rooted into the documents, which are taken to be the ground truth. So that's just one example, but that's a very, you know, it's an emerging question. Like, you know, we're all came out in November, right? You know, it's what, 7 months old? Right? We're still trying to figure out how to do this. Like, people are working on it. But you're right, hallucination, huge, huge, huge problem.
We're out of time, I'm sorry to say,
Yeah,
but I did want to end on one fun, quick thing, which is the question, do we think AI will ever replace doctors?
God, I hope not.
No, I don't think so. I mean, again, I think it's going to augment and perhaps, you know, augment what medical professionals do, make their lives a little bit easier, but I don't think it's going to replace it. And I mean, would you trust it right now? Right? It's very empathetic from what I hear.
That's what I hear. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, both of you. Thank you.